50 men, elite SS killers, sitting in a dining hall, laughing, drinking, celebrating the destruction of Europe. They believe they are untouchable. They believe they are the masters of the world. But just 20 ft away in a kitchen that smells of potatoes, and fear is a 52-year-old woman. She isn't a soldier. She isn't a spy. She is a nun. And in the pocket of her gray habit, she holds the power to erase an entire German command unit in less than an hour. This isn't a movie. This isn't a fairy tale. On a quiet Sunday morning in March 1945, Sister Maria Antonyina didn't just pray for evil to stop. She stopped it herself. She turned a convent kitchen into a slaughterhouse. But what happened next wasn't just an escape. It was a nightmare that would cost the lives of 200 innocent people and bury this secret for 50 years. Why did the British government hide this story? And how did one elderly woman outsmart the Third Reich? Buckle up. We are going back to the moment the poison hit the pot. To understand the kill, you have to understand the cage. The location is Posen, a city swallowed whole by the Nazi war machine. For 5 years, this wasn't just an occupation. It was an eraser. The convent of the Sacred Heart, a place built for silence and prayer, had been hijacked. The SS kicked down the doors in September 1939. They didn't burn it down. No, they did something far more insulting. They turned it into a luxury resort for murderers. These weren't your average frontline grunts or conscripted teenagers. These were the architects of doom, officers rotating off the Eastern Front. Men whose hands were stained with the blood of Warsaw, Kiev, and Stalingrad. They came here to sleep in holy beds, to eat off holy plates, to wash the grime of genocide off their skin before going back to do it again. And serving them were 5 nuns kept alive for one reason only: slave labor. For 125 days, Sister Maria was the head cook. She cooked their meals. She scrubbed the floors. She washed the blood out of uniforms that didn't belong to them. She was forced to smile. She was forced to bow. She was forced to become invisible. Think about the psychological torture of that existence. Every night hearing them laugh about burning villages. Every morning pouring coffee for men who had signed death warrants for children. Most people would break under that pressure. Most people would give up. But Sister Maria was calculating. She realized something that the Allies didn't. The SS were arrogant. They didn't look at the nun and see a threat. They looked at her and saw furniture. And that was their fatal mistake. By March 1945, the end was near. The Red Army was crashing through the East, a tidal wave of vengeance. The Americans were hammering the West. Germany was collapsing. But inside the convent, the party was still going. The officers were delusional. They held elaborate Sunday lunches complete with wine and music, celebrating victories that no longer existed. Sister Maria knew this couldn't go on. She knew these men were planning to slip away. They would change their names, ditch their uniforms, and disappear into the chaos of a defeated Germany. They would live out their lives as shopkeepers and teachers, escaping justice forever. She knew that if she didn't act now, nobody would. She needed a weapon. She didn't have a gun. She didn't have a knife, but she had the basement. Every old building in Europe had a rat problem, and every convent had a solution. Arsenic trioxide. It is a nasty way to go. Tasteless, odorless. It doesn't kill you instantly like a bullet. It plays a cruel game with your body. First the cramps, then the burning thirst, then total organ failure. Sister Maria found the stash in the cellar used to control the rodent population that thrived in the old stone walls. A fine white powder, innocuous to the eye, but lethal to the blood. She didn't measure it with a chemist's scale. She measured it with rage. But here is the catch. The timing had to be perfect. If she poisoned the breakfast, the officers would scatter at different times. If she poisoned the dinner, The night guards might catch her escaping in the dark. It had to be the Sunday lunch, the grand meal. All 50 officers were required to attend. It was mandatory. A full house, a captive audience. Sunday, March 11th, 1945. The weather broke. The snow was melting, creating rivers of mud in the courtyard. Inside the kitchen, the air smelled of carrots, potatoes, and celery. Sister Maria stood over a massive iron cauldron. Vegetable soup, golden, rich, the officer's favorite. She had the vial tucked in her habit. This was the point of no return. You have to understand the risk here. If an officer walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, if someone tasted the soup early, Sister Maria wouldn't just be shot. The SS would torture her. They would execute the other 4 nuns. They would burn the town. Her hands were shaking as she held the glass. But then she remembered January. 2 months earlier, she had watched from the kitchen window as a group of Jewish prisoners were marched past the convent gate. One young woman, skeletal and freezing, collapsed in the snow. An SS captain, one of the men sitting in the dining room right now, had walked over. He didn't help the woman. He drew his pistol and shot her in the head. He did it without hesitation, without emotion. Then he walked inside, sat at the table, and asked Maria for more bread. That was the moment the nun died, and the Avenger was born. Back in the kitchen, it is March 11th. Sister Maria pulls the vial. She uncorks it. She dumps the entire contents into the boiling broth. 3G per man, a lethal overdose. She stirs it in. The powder dissolves instantly, vanishing into the golden broth without a trace. The soup looks the same. It smells the same. But now it is liquid death. At 11:30 a.m., the boots thunder on the floorboards. 50 men take their seats, uniforms pressed, medals shining. They are joking about the war. They are talking about their pensions. Sister Maria rolls the card out. She is the waitress of her own execution squad. She ladles the soup into the porcelain bowls. Steam rises into the faces of the killers. Imagine the nerves of steel required to do this. She has to serve them, look them in the eye, and not flinch. One officer complains, telling her to hurry up. She bows. She places the bowl in front of him. He picks up his spoon. He blows on the soup. He takes the first bite. "Delicious," he says. The other officers dig in. Sister Maria retreats to the kitchen shadows. She watches through the crack in the door. They are eating it all. Some are asking for seconds. One young lieutenant, 25 years old, eats 3 bowls. He has just ingested enough arsenic to kill a horse. Now comes the wait. Arsenic takes time. 30 minutes, maybe an hour. The minutes drag by like hours. 12 p.m., or nothing. 12:15 p.m., still laughing. 12:30 p.m., Sister Maria starts to panic. Did the heat destroy the poison? Did she miscalculate? Was this all for nothing? She stands in the dark, her back pressed against the cold stone, praying for the screaming to start. At 12:45 p.m., the young lieutenant stands up. He looks confused. He touches his stomach. His face goes pale, then ashen. He stumbles away from the table, muttering about needing air. The other officers laugh at him. They think he can't handle his wine. But then another man stands up. Then 2 more. The laughter stops. A heavy, suffocating silence falls over the room. Then the first scream cuts through the air. It hits them all at once. Violent convulsions, fire in the gut. Officers are falling out of their chairs, clawing at the tablecloths, dragging dishes to the floor. It is absolute chaos. Someone screams that it's poison. Someone screams for a medic, but it's too late. The arsenic is already in the bloodstream. It's shutting down kidneys. It's stopping hearts. In the kitchen, Sister Maria doesn't stay to watch the finale. The clock has started. She has maybe 5 minutes before they come for her. She sheds the habit. Underneath, she is wearing a gray civilian dress. She grabs a small bag containing a fake ID and a map. She heads for the cellar. The convent is on lockdown. Guards are shouting outside. The gates are sealed. But the nuns knew secrets the SS didn't. Centuries ago, monks built drainage tunnels under the foundation. Narrow, wet, forgotten. Sister Maria pushes aside a stack of old crates in the basement. There it is, a hole in the wall, barely wide enough for a human. It smells of rot and sewage. She crawls in. Above her head, she can hear the boots of the execution squad storming the kitchen. They find the pot, they find the ladle, but the cook is gone. She crawls for 300 minutes. Her knees are bleeding against the rough stone. The air is thin and foul, but she keeps moving. She emerges in a drainage ditch outside the perimeter wall, hidden by overgrown bushes. She is out, but she isn't safe. Posen is crawling with patrols. She has to make it to a safe house 3 kilometers north, an abandoned farmhouse. She is 52 years old. She is malnourished. She is exhausted. And now she is the most wanted woman in Poland. Back at the convent, the medics are arriving. It is a scene from hell. Bodies everywhere. 47 men are dead or dying. Only 3 survived because they arrived late. The SS commander is furious. He orders a manhunt. His orders are simple. Find the nun and kill everyone who knows her. Sister Maria moves through the frozen woods. She hides in ditches as trucks roar past on the nearby highway. She freezes as dogs bark in the distance. Every snap of a twig sounds like a gunshot. She reaches the farmhouse at sunset. It is a ruin, burnt out, roof collapsed. She creeps inside. This is the rendezvous. The resistance promised to meet her here. She waits in the dark. Minutes pass. Hours. Did they forget her? Were they captured? Then she hears footsteps on the broken glass. Multiple men. She grabs a piece of wood. It is useless, but it is instinct. A flashlight beams in her face. A voice speaks in Polish. It calls her by her real name. Maria. We are friends. It is Potter, a resistance leader. He looks at her with awe. Word has already spread. The local grapevine is faster than the radio. He tells her the news. They are dead. She killed them all. Sister Maria doesn't smile. She collapses. But Potter has bad news. They have to move immediately. The SS are burning the village. This is the cost of war. Sister Maria saved the future. But the present is demanding a blood price. The SS didn't just look for her. They rounded up 200 civilians in the town square. Men, boys, old grandfathers. And they opened fire. Retaliation, collective punishment. As Sister Maria runs into the night with the resistance, she can see the smoke rising from the town. She knows that smoke is her fault. This is the moral weight she will carry for the rest of her life. Was it worth it? 47 monsters for 200 innocents. It is a question that will haunt her every step of the way to the American lines. The journey west became a blur of frozen fields, abandoned villages, and near misses with death. Sister Maria and her 3 protectors moved like ghosts through a landscape that had been shattered by 6 years of war. They traveled only between midnight and dawn, when the darkness provided cover, but also concealed 1,000 dangers. They slept in root cellars, in the attics of sympathetic farmers, in forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They ate whatever they could find. Stale bread, frozen potatoes dug from abandoned gardens. Once a thin soup made from melted snow and wild onions. Sister Maria's body, already weakened by years of deprivation at the convent, began to fail. Her feet blistered and bled. Her lungs rattled with every breath. But she never complained. She never asked to stop, because she knew that stopping meant dying. And she refused to die before her story was told. On the 7th night, they encountered a German patrol. It happened just outside a small village, whose name Sister Maria never learned. They were crossing an open field, moving in single file, when the beam of a flashlight swept across the darkness. Someone shouted in German, "Halt!" The resistance fighters reacted instantly. Potter grabbed Sister Maria and pulled her to the ground. The young boy, whose name was Jakob, drew a pistol from his coat. The woman, whose name was Christina, motioned for everyone to stay silent. The German patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, all of them young, all of them exhausted. They were Wehrmacht, not SS, regular army. Conscripts, probably, who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and go home. They approached cautiously, their rifles raised but not aimed. Pot stood slowly, hands visible, and began speaking in broken German. He told them he was a farmer returning home with his family. He told them they had been visiting relatives in the next town. He told them they had papers. The German soldiers didn't believe him. Sister Maria could see it in their eyes. They had heard too many lies, seen too many tricks. One of them, a sergeant with a scar on his chin, demanded to see the papers. Potter reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and produced a set of forged documents. The sergeant examined them under the beam of his flashlight. He looked at Potter, then at Christina, then at Jakob, and finally at Sister Maria. His eyes lingered on her face. She looked away, terrified that he would see through the disguise, that he would recognize her as the nun from the convent. The sergeant asked her a question in German. She didn't understand. Christina quickly intervened, explaining in German that Sister Maria was deaf and mute, a childhood illness. The sergeant stared at Sister Maria for a long moment. Then he looked back at Pot, and he did something unexpected. He handed the papers back and told them to go quickly before his commanding officer arrived. Sister Maria didn't understand what had just happened until they were a kilometer away. Porter explained that the sergeant had seen through their story, but had chosen to let them go anyway. It happened sometimes, especially this late in the war. Soldiers who were tired of killing, soldiers who no longer believed in the cause, soldiers who simply wanted the nightmare to end. The sergeant could have arrested them. He could have called for reinforcements, but instead, he had given them a chance. Sister Maria wondered if he knew who she was, if word of the poisoning had spread beyond the SS, if he had looked at her and seen not a fugitive, but a symbol of something larger, an act of defiance that even some Germans could respect. She would never know. But for the first time since she had poured the poison into the soup, she felt something other than guilt. She felt a flicker of hope. By the 14th night, they reached the front lines. The sound of artillery fire rumbled in the distance like thunder that never stopped. The sky glowed orange on the horizon, lit by burning villages and exploding ammunition depots. The resistance fighters led Sister Maria to the edge of a dense forest where the trees had been shredded by shrapnel and the ground was pocked with craters. Potter pointed toward a distant ridge. Beyond that ridge, he said, were British forces. They had advanced rapidly in the past week and were now holding a defensive line along a river. If Sister Maria could cross the ridge and reach the river, she would be safe. But she would have to go alone. The resistance fighters couldn't risk crossing into Allied territory. They had work to do, people to save, a country to rebuild. Potter handed Sister Maria a white cloth and told her to wave it. As she approached the British lines, he told her to shout that she was a refugee, that she was Polish, that she needed help. Then he hugged her. It was brief, awkward, but filled with a respect that words could not convey. Christina and Jacob said their goodbyes as well, and then they disappeared back into the forest, leaving Sister Maria alone at the edge of freedom. Sister Maria stood at the edge of the forest for a long time, staring at the ridge that separated her from safety. The white cloth hung limp in her hand. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Every part of her body screamed for rest, but she knew that if she stopped now, if she allowed herself to collapse, she might never get up again. So she began walking, one foot in front of the other. The terrain was brutal. The ground had been churned by tank treads and artillery shells, transforming what had once been farmland into a muddy wasteland. Craters filled with stagnant water dotted the landscape. Twisted metal remains of destroyed vehicles jutted from the earth like broken bones. The air smelled of smoke and chemicals. And everywhere there was silence. A terrible, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sound. No birds, no wind, just the distant rumble of guns and the wet squelch of her footsteps in the mud. Halfway up the ridge, Sister Maria stumbled and fell. Her hands plunged into cold mud. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her vision blurred. She realized with a detached kind of clarity that she was dying. Her body had reached its limit. 2 weeks of walking through frozen nights, 2 weeks of barely eating. 2 weeks of fear and adrenaline and guilt had drained every reserve she had. She lay there in the mud, staring up at the gray sky, and thought about the soup. She thought about the officers collapsing in the dining hall. She thought about the 200 civilians executed in retaliation. She thought about the young German sergeant who had let her go. And she thought about the young woman who had been shot in the snow. All of it swirled together in her mind, a chaotic tapestry of violence and mercy, of sin and salvation. She didn't know if what she had done was right. She would never know, but she knew it had been necessary, and that would have to be enough. Then she heard voices, English voices. She forced her eyes open and saw figures approaching. Soldiers in khaki uniforms, British troops. They were shouting at her, but she couldn't make out the words. One of them knelt beside her, checking for wounds. Another was speaking into a radio. Sister Maria tried to lift the white cloth, tried to wave it, but her arm wouldn't move. She whispered the only words she had left. "I am Polish. I escaped." Sister Maria spent 3 weeks in a British field hospital, hovering between life and death. The doctors called it a medical miracle. Her body had shut down. Malnutrition, pneumonia, severe exposure. By all medical logic, she should have died in the mud on that ridge. But there is a fire in this woman that biology cannot explain. She refused to let go. She spent days in a delirious fever, muttering names in her sleep. The doctors thought she was praying for the dead. They didn't realize she was listing her victims. When she finally opened her eyes, the war was different. The artillery was distant. The voices were English. She was safe. But safety brought a new kind of danger. In 1945, the Allied lines were flooded with millions of refugees, displaced persons, spies, war criminals trying to blend in. The British Army didn't trust anyone. Every person crossing the line had to be vetted, questioned, and categorized. Sister Maria was just another face in the crowd, another gray, broken woman in a sea of misery. Or so they thought. 2 days after she woke up, a young intelligence officer named Captain Harris sat by her bed. He was tired. He had interviewed hundreds of refugees that week. He expected a standard story, a destroyed home, a missing family, a plea for food stamps. He opened his notebook, licked his pencil, and asked for her name. Sister Maria looked at him with eyes that had seen the inside of hell. She didn't give him a sob story. She didn't ask for sympathy. She leaned forward and whispered 5 words that would change the classification of her file from refugee to high-priority asset. She said, "I poisoned the SS command." Captain Harris stopped writing. He looked at the nun. He looked at her frail hands, her gray hair, her trembling voice. He laughed. Not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. It sounded insane. It sounded like the hallucinations of a traumatized mind. A nun killing the elite of the Third Reich. It was impossible. He closed his notebook. He told her to rest. He walked away, dismissing her confession as fever dreams. But Sister Maria was persistent. The next day when he returned, she gave him details, specifics, that a hallucinating woman couldn't invent. She told him the date, March 11th. She told him the location, the convent of the Sacred Heart in Posen. She told him the weapon, arsenic trioxide, and most importantly, she told him the result, 47 dead officers. Captain Harris was no longer laughing. He was listening. He realized that if she was telling the truth, this wasn't just a story. This was a major intelligence coup. But if she was lying, she was wasting precious time. He decided to run a test. He sent a message up the chain of command to intelligence headquarters. He asked for verification. He wanted to know if there were any reports of a mass casualty event in Posen around March 11th. He didn't expect a reply. Posen was deep behind enemy lines, now under Soviet control. Information was scarce. But 24 hours later, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope. Inside was a transcript of an intercepted German radio transmission. The Enigma code breakers at Bletchley Park had picked it up weeks ago, but hadn't understood its significance until now. The transmission was from the SS High Command in Berlin, demanding a report on the Posen incident. The German report was chaotic. It mentioned a catastrophic poisoning. It mentioned sabotage. It mentioned that the local command structure had been wiped out. The dates matched. The location matched. The body count matched. Captain Harris stared at the paper, his hands shaking. He looked across the hospital ward at the little old lady eating porridge. She wasn't crazy. She was the deadliest person in the room. The tone of the British changed instantly. Sister Maria was moved from the general ward to a private room. Armed guards were placed at the door, not to keep her in, but to keep her safe. Senior officers arrived, majors, colonels, men from MI6. They wanted to know everything. They set up a tape recorder for 3 days. They debriefed her. They treated it like a murder investigation. They needed to know how she did it, how she sourced the poison, how she bypassed the guards, how she escaped. They were fascinated by the mechanics of the kill. They looked at her with a mix of horror and respect. Here were men trained in warfare, men who commanded tanks and bombers, listening to a nun explain how she wiped out a battalion with soup. But as the debriefing went on, a darker reality began to set in. The British officers weren't just interested in what she did. They were worried about the political fallout. You have to remember the context. It is April 1945. The war in Europe is ending, but the Cold War is beginning. The Soviets are taking Poland. The relationship between the West and Russia is crumbling. The British realized that Sister Maria's story was a political grenade. If they publicized it, if they made her a hero, the Soviets might demand her extradition. The Russians viewed Poland as their territory. They would want to interrogate her. They would want to know who helped her. They would want to expose the resistance network she used, the same network the British were trying to recruit for the coming conflict with Moscow. And then there was the retaliation. The British confirmed the massacre of the 200 civilians in Posen. Intelligence reports showed that the SS had used the poisoning as an excuse to purge the town of partisans. The officers in the room looked at the files. They looked at the photos of the mass graves in Posen. They debated the morality of it in hushed tones while Sister Maria slept. Was she a hero, or was she a trigger for mass murder? If they celebrated her, would the Nazis kill more prisoners in the final weeks of the war? Would the German propaganda machine use her story to say, "Look, the Allies use nuns to poison food. We must fight to the death"? It was a nightmare scenario. So, a decision was made, a decision that came from the very top. Sister Maria's file was stamped top secret. Her story would not be released to the press. There would be no medals, no headlines, no BBC radio interviews. They told her it was for her own safety. They told her that Nazi werewolf units, sleeper cells of fanatics, would hunt her down if they knew her name. That was partially true, but the real reason was politics. They needed to bury the incident to keep the peace with the Soviets and to prevent German propaganda victories. Sister Maria was erased. The woman who had struck one of the hardest blows against the SS was told to go back to being a nobody. Sister Maria accepted this. In fact, she welcomed it. She didn't want fame. She didn't want to be known as the poison nun. She was still grappling with the weight of her soul. Every night she saw the faces of the men she killed. Yes, they were monsters. Yes, they deserved it. But she was a woman of God. She had broken the sixth commandment. She had looked into the eyes of a young man, that 25-year-old lieutenant, and fed him death while he thanked her for the meal. That is a stain that prayer does not wash away. She told Captain Harris, "I do not want a medal. I want penance." When she was discharged from the hospital, the British gave her a choice. She could stay in England. They offered her a new identity, a small pension, a cottage in the countryside. She could live out her days in safety, far away from the blood-soaked soil of Poland. It was a generous offer. Most refugees would have taken it in a heartbeat. But Sister Maria shook her head. England was not her home, and more importantly, she couldn't run away from what she had done. She felt a pull to return to the scene of the crime, or at least to the country where it happened. She felt that her spiritual salvation lay in returning to the wreckage and helping to rebuild. She asked to be sent back to Poland. The British officers thought she was mad. Poland was now under Soviet occupation. It was dangerous. The communists were cracking down on the church. Resistance fighters like Potter and Christina were being arrested by the Russian NKVD, labeled as Western spies. If Sister Maria went back, she would be walking from one prison into another. But she was adamant. She said, "My work is not finished." Reluctantly, they arranged her transport. They put her on a train with thousands of other repatriated Poles. They gave her false papers again just in case. They shook her hand and watched her disappear into the fog of the East. The return journey was bleak. Poland in 1945 was a graveyard. Cities were leveled. The smell of ash was everywhere. Sister Maria didn't go back to Posen. She couldn't. The memories were too sharp, and the risk of being recognized by a local collaborator was too high. Instead, she headed south toward Kov. She found a small, impoverished convent that had been turned into a makeshift orphanage. The nuns there were overwhelmed. Dozens of children, parents lost to the camps or the fighting, were living in squalor. They needed help. They needed a cook. Sister Maria walked into the kitchen, tied on an apron, and went to work. For the next 10 years, this was her life. She woke up at 4 a.m. She prayed. She cooked. She cleaned. She never spoke of the war. To the other sisters, she was just Sister Maria, a quiet, hard-working woman with sad eyes. They didn't know that the hands peeling potatoes were the same hands that had wiped out an SS command unit. They didn't know that the woman humming hymns in the chapel was a classified British intelligence asset. She lived in total anonymity. But she was watching. She was watching the new occupiers, the Soviets, do the same things the Nazis had done. Arrests in the night, disappearances, the suppression of faith. It was a bitter pill to swallow. She had killed for freedom, but freedom hadn't come. Only a new master had arrived. The psychological toll was immense. We know this now because of the diaries she kept during this period. Diaries that were found decades later. In them, she wrote about her nightmares. She wrote about the golden soup. She wrote about the black uniforms. She questioned God. "Why did you make me the instrument of death?" She wrote in 1948, "Why did you let me survive when so many innocents died?" She was haunted by the 200 civilians in Posen. She felt that their blood was on her hands, not the Nazis. She spent hours in the confessional, but she never confessed the poisoning. She couldn't. She knew the priest would be obligated to report a crime of that magnitude, or worse, he might be a police informant. So, she confessed to anger and pride, hiding the true sin beneath layers of silence. But the past has a way of resurfacing. In 1956, during a brief thaw in the Cold War, a stranger came to the convent in Kov. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't police. He was a man with a limp and a scar across his cheek. Sister Maria was in the garden tending to the winter cabbages when she saw him standing by the gate. She froze. It had been 11 years, but she knew that face. It was Potter, the resistance leader who had pulled her out of the farmhouse, the man who had saved her life. He had aged. His hair was white. He looked broken by the Soviet occupation. But he had found her. He didn't come to expose her. He came to say goodbye. He was dying of tuberculosis, a souvenir from 3 years in a Soviet gulag. He wanted to see her one last time. They sat on a bench in the freezing wind. They didn't talk about the poisoning. They didn't talk about the war. They just sat in silence. Two ghosts who had survived the end of the world. Before he left, Pyotr grabbed her hand. He whispered, "It mattered. What you did, it mattered." He told her that he had met a survivor from Posen years later. The survivors said that after the poisoning, the German morale in the town collapsed. The SS became paranoid. They started fighting each other. They stopped hunting partisans because they were too busy testing their own food. That chaos allowed hundreds of people to escape before the final Russian assault. "You didn't just kill 47 men," Potter said. "You broke their spirit." That conversation changed everything for Sister Maria. For 11 years, she had looked at her action as a sin. Now she began to see it as a sacrifice. She hadn't washed the blood off her hands, but she finally understood why it was there. She went back to her kitchen with a lighter step. She continued to serve. She continued to pray. The years rolled by. The world changed. Man walked on the moon. The Beatles played on the radio. The Iron Curtain rusted. But inside the convent walls, time stood still. Sister Maria grew old. Her back bent. Her hands became arthritic. But she never retired. She cooked until she could no longer lift the pots. By the 1970s, she was bedridden. The younger nuns would sit by her side reading to her. They loved her, but they didn't know her. They thought she was just a sweet old lady who made the best vegetable soup in the district. They had no idea that they were sitting next to one of the most effective assassins of World War II. In 1977, as she lay dying, the Mother Superior came to give her last rites. Sister Maria was drifting in and out of consciousness. In her final moments, she grabbed the Mother Superior's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She tried to speak. She tried to confess. She murmured, "The soup, the poison, tell them." But the words were jumbled. The Mother Superior smiled gently, patting her hand. "Rest now, sister. The soup is finished." She thought Maria was delirious about kitchen chores. Sister Maria Antonyina died on a Tuesday afternoon. She was buried in the convent cemetery under a simple wooden cross. No dates, no military honors, just her name and the date of her death. The secret should have died with her. The British file was still locked in a vault in London, marked closed until 2020. The Soviet files in Posen had been burned in the 90s. There was no reason for the world to ever know. But history is a stubborn thing. It refuses to stay buried. 14 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Iron Curtain fell. And in London, a clerk at the Ministry of Defense was sorting through old, declassified war files that were being prepared for public release. He picked up a dusty folder, stamped Top Secret Operation Posen. He opened it. He started reading and his jaw dropped. He realized he was holding a Hollywood movie script that was actually real life. He contacted a historian. The historian contacted a journalist, and suddenly the ghost of Sister Maria began to rise from the grave. The investigation that followed would shock the world. In 1991, the world was distracted. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. The map of Europe was being redrawn. But in a quiet archives room in London, a historian named Dr. Thomas Lewandowski was about to redraw our understanding of courage. He had been granted access to the British Ministry of Defence's newly declassified Section D files, documents related to sabotage and irregular warfare during World War II. He was looking for data on bridge bombings. Instead, he found a file titled The Posen Incident, March 1945. Mr. Lewandowski opened the folder, expecting a dry military report. What he found was the interrogation transcript of Sister Maria. He read it once, then he read it again. He couldn't believe it. A nun poisoning 50 SS officers. It sounded like a thriller novel. But the stamps on the document were real. The signatures of the British intelligence officers were real. The classification markings were real. Lewandowski realized he was holding a ghost story in his hands. He immediately booked a flight to Poland. He had to know if this was true or if it was some elaborate wartime fabrication created by British spies to confuse the Germans. He arrived in Poznan, formerly Posen, in the winter of 1992. The city had changed, but the scars were still there if you knew where to look. He went to the town hall records. He looked for death certificates from March 1945, and there they were, a cluster of German death registrations, all dated March 11th and 12th. Cause of death listed vaguely as heart failure or stomach ailment. But the sheer number of them, 47 officers dying in a 48-hour window, was statistically impossible without a catastrophic event. The British file was right. The Germans had covered it up, but the paper trail remained. Then Lewandowski went to the site of the old convent. It was no longer a religious house. It had been converted into a municipal library after the war, but the structure was the same. The kitchen was still in the basement. The drainage tunnel, the one Sister Maria had crawled through, was still there, though it had been sealed up with brick decades ago. Standing in that kitchen, the historian felt a chill. This was the room. This was where the soup was made. This was where the decision was made. But the most heartbreaking piece of evidence wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the town square. Lewandowski found a memorial plaque dedicated to the 200 martyrs of March. It listed the names of the civilians executed by the SS in retaliation. For 50 years, the locals had mourned them, but they never knew why they had been killed. They thought it was just random Nazi cruelty. Lewandowski's discovery changed that. It revealed the terrible cause and effect. The town had paid the price for the convent's vengeance. When Lewandowski published his findings in 1993, it sent a shockwave through Poland. The story of Sister Maria was finally out. Journalists flocked to the convent in Kov where she was buried. They found the simple wooden cross. They interviewed the few remaining elderly nuns who had known her. The nuns were shocked. Sister Maria, they said, he wouldn't hurt a fly. She spent her whole life praying. They had lived beside a warrior and never knew it. This revelation started a fierce debate. Was she a hero, or was she responsible for the massacre of the 200 civilians? The Vatican was silent, the historians argued. But the people of Poland and eventually the world came to a different conclusion. They saw a woman who had been pushed to the absolute breaking point. A woman who realized that praying for justice wasn't enough. Sometimes you have to force God's hand. Sister Maria's story forces us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. We like our war heroes to be soldiers in uniform charging machine gun nests. We understand that kind of bravery. But what about the bravery of the kitchen? What about the bravery of the poison vial? It is messy. It is dark. It blurs the line between justice and murder. But that is what World War II was. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a desperate, clawing struggle for survival against an enemy that wanted to erase entire nations. Sister Maria Antonyina died believing she was a sinner. She died thinking she had failed God. But look at the legacy she left behind. She proved that the SS were not invincible. She proved that even in the darkest hole of the occupation, resistance was possible. And most importantly, she proved that you don't need a tank to fight a war. Sometimes all you need is a pot of soup and the will to use it. Her file is no longer secret. Her name is no longer erased. The British government eventually acknowledged her contribution, noting that the disruption caused by the poisoning likely saved thousands of other lives by destabilizing the German command in the region during the critical final weeks of the war. She didn't win a medal. She didn't get a parade. But she got something better. She got the truth. Today, if you visit that old convent in Poznan, there is no statue of her. There is no grand monument. But sometimes on cold March mornings, the locals say you can still smell the faint aroma of vegetable soup wafting from the old basement vents. A reminder that in this building, the devil sat down for dinner, and a nun made sure he never got up. This story was buried for 50 years. It was a missing page of history, torn out by politicians and spies who decided we couldn't handle the truth. They wanted us to forget Sister Maria. They wanted us to forget the complexity of her choice. But we found the page, and we are reading it aloud. This brings us to the end of her journey. But it is just the beginning of ours. History is full of these shadows. It is full of men and women who did the impossible and then vanished into the fog. They are waiting for us to find them. So, here is my question to you. If you were in Sister Maria's position, if you had the poison and you had the SS officers sitting at your table, would you have done it? Would you have poured the vial knowing the Germans might retaliate against the town, or would you have stayed your hand? It is not an easy question. I want to see your answers in the comments below. Let's debate the morality of the golden soup. If this story shook you, if it made you see the war in a different light, then you are in the right place. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the stories they didn't teach you in school. We dig through the classified files, the forgotten diaries, and the silenced witnesses. We are putting the history books back together, one page at a time. This is WWII Missing Pages. Do not let these stories die again. Click that subscribe button right now. Hit the bell icon so you are the first to know when we uncover the next secret. We have a video coming up next week about a German pilot who risked execution to drop candy to American children. You do not want to miss that. Like this video to honor the memory of the 200. Share it to spread the truth about Sister Maria. And until next time, keep turning the pages.